Hello. Welcome to the Mise en Française of New York University. My name is Phillip John Usher. This is the fifth episode of our series dedicated to the author Michel de Montaigne and to his essay. Apologies if my voice is a little bit off today. I'm just recovering from COVID. So my guest today is Professor Cathy Yandell. Hello, Cathy. Thank you for joining us. So Cathy Yandell is the W.I. and Hulda F. Daniel Professor of French Literature, Language, and Culture in the Department of French and Francophone Studies at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. An eminent specialist of early modern and modern French literature and culture, Cathy Yandell has published widely in both French and English. Her earliest work focused on Pontus de Thiard, both the critical edition of his dialogue about music, the Solitaire Second, ou Discours de la musique, published by Dauvois in 1980, and an article on that same work published in BHR 2 years earlier. After Pontus de Thiard, Cathy Yandell turned her attention to many other authors of the period, with a particular interest for the question of the body and the body's entanglement with time, what it means for time to pass and what it means for time to pass while being a body. Her Carpe Corpus, Time and Gender in Early Modern France, published by Delaware in 2000, is a compelling study of the ways in which poets attempt to capture time, a study rightly described by one reviewer as, quote, erudite, innovative, and highly productive, féconde. Cathy is also an avid and collegial collaborator. She co-edited Vieillir à la Renaissance with Colette Wynne for Champion in 2009, to which she also contributed a chapter on Marc-Antoine Muret. She also co-edited more recently, this time with David LaGuardia, an important collection of essays titled Memory and Community in 16th Century France, published by Routledge in 2015, whose authors show how the interactions of memory and community fashion both individuals and especially groups in conflict during the wars of religion. Throughout her career, Cathy Yandell has come back time and again to Montaigne, starting with an early article on Montaigne's chapter on sexuality, 3-5 sur des vers de Virgile, on some verses of Virgil, titled Corps et Corpus, which anticipates already her book Carpe Corpus, which I already mentioned before. Most recently, this year in 2023, she published Montaigne's Cogito in a special issue of Montaigne Studies, edited by Amy Graves on the question of Material Montaigne. In this piece, Cathy takes up the question of Montaigne's relationship to Descartes, a topic already treated by others, but to put the emphasis squarely on embodied cognition, which is to say on how the body figures into the process of thinking about thinking by both philosophers, a topic explored in that piece in particular through a close and compelling reading of 2-6 de l'exercitation on practice, a chapter Cathy calls a manifesto for the primacy of the material body in the writing of the self. Montaigne also makes an appearance in Cathy's latest book, The French Art of Living Well, published recently by St. Martin's Press. Part memoir, part masterclass, The French Art of Living Well is the story of a life lived across cultures and languages. It opens with Cathy's arrival in France as a teenager on the ocean liner Essais France and her discovery of all things French while living with the Hamel near the Champ de Mars. Throughout the book, and in that it is a true reflection of Cathy herself, puts the emphasis on joy and on happiness, on the chance encounters that make life good and worth living. There are many moments about cultural history and cultural differences, from the specifically late-night nature of French weddings, Article R4228-19 of the French Labor Code that forbids eating lunch at one's desk, the Austrian-Turkish origins of the croissant, French etiquette about which flowers to bring or not to bring when invited to dinner, French versus American understandings of personal space, and much more. As is not surprising given Cathy's academic focus on the early modern period, the early modern period is often referenced in The French Art of Living Well. For example, how a professor with an angelic voice made the poetry of Du Bellay come to life. I don't know who that was. Maybe she'll tell us. Catherine de Medici's role in bringing perfume to France, thanks to her perfumer and perhaps poison maker Renato Bianco. A conference in Rouen about Jean de Léry that included a nighttime walk with a mysterious writer referred to only as Pascal X. The joy of handling an edition of Ronsard's Amour from 1552. I couldn't believe my good fortune to hold a 16th century book with the stamp of the King's Library on it, Bibliothèque Royale. Henry II may have held this very book in his hands, or Mary Stuart, or Ronsard himself. And indeed, there is Montaigne. In the book's third chapter, Sparking the Mind, largely focused on literature, prominent place is given to a number of writers: Descartes, Stendhal, Baudelaire, my first true love, Hugo, Voltaire, Camus, Duras, and especially Montaigne. If I could take just one thick book to a deserted island, Cathy writes, Montaigne's Essays would be it. This book takes readers on a trip into Montaigne's mind and body and into their own. The essayist sees life as continually in flux, with the only constant being inconstancy. He seems to delight in the water as it flows around his feet. Montaigne isn't preaching. He's sharing with readers something that has dawned on him, or that he has been mulling over for a while, a point that Cathy underscores with a quotation from 3.2 du Repentir: Je n'enseigne point, je raconte. I don't teach, I tell stories. There's a brief discussion of 2.2 de l'ivrognerie on drunkenness for discussion about wine, and then a longer discussion of your favorite chapter, Cathy, but I won't say which one, as that's a question we'll get to shortly. Cathy Yandell is my guest today. Thank you so much for being here. So as a quick reminder, each episode of this series is divided into 3 parts. In the first moment, Cathy will answer the Montaigne questionnaire, the same questions that I ask in each episode. And the goal is to open up a friendly and relaxed discussion of Montaigne so that we can get to know each other as readers of Montaigne. In a second moment, Cathy will present some of her own thinking on a topic related to Montaigne. And then in a third and final moment, we'll have a moment of discussion with you who are joining us by Zoom. Please go ahead, as of now, entering your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Donc, n'hésitez pas à taper dès maintenant vos questions en anglais ou en français avec l'option Q&A au bas de votre écran, Zoom, and I'll be reading those out when we get to that part of today's conversation. So without further ado, here we go. And we will turn to the Montaigne questionnaire. I'm just going to unmute Cathy. There we go. So Cathy, you need to accept unmuting in just it should have, there we go. And so my first question, Cathy, is the following, very simple. When, how, and why did you first read Montaigne's essay?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Philip, for this invitation and the overly generous introduction, but this is just a marvelous series that you came up with, and I just wanted to thank you for that, and thanks to everyone who's listening in. How did I come to read Montaigne? Well, I'm probably the only one in our field who didn't read Montaigne until graduate school, because I had been to France for my junior year abroad and sort of had Racine and Corneille and Molière coming out of my ears from the Sorbonne, because that was really what everyone wanted to teach, along with a little theater. But so I was in graduate school, and I'd been studying everything from, of course, at the time, Chrétien de Troyes to Marguerite Duras to Derrida. And I wrote my master's thesis on Raymond Roussel, who's this obscure but interesting, fascinating surrealist. And then I delved into the sort of convolutions of Blanchot with Anne Smock. And I want to quote from her here just briefly to show sort of what I was working against when I came to Montaigne. Writing exposes you to the central point, Blanchot said. Rather than reaching it, you get left at it, left waiting because you missed your chance to wait. It is as if, with respect to the central point, you'd been in too much of a hurry and had covered the distance separating you from it too fast, and had thus got there without the means to arrive. Now, Anne Smock is absolutely brilliant, and Blanchot is fascinating, but then in a seminar with Len Johnson, who is the angelic reader of Du Bellay, I discovered Montaigne, who seemed to be writing about things that mattered. And like Blanchot, he was writing about writing. And the essays were not less intellectual or less challenging, but Montaigne seemed to be asking fundamental questions about what it is to be human. And so, although Montaigne didn't specifically address what I was studying at the time, that is deconstruction and gender and many other things, he raised a lot of theoretical questions that I really could relate to, and thought that other people that I might be teaching could do the same. And then plus a final thing is, as a pretty serious dancer, as an undergrad and a graduate student, I love the insistence on the human body. So even though I spent a lot of my time studying poetry, I was very interested in form. And so it was fascinating to me to find this essay, which was sort of a formless form of autofiction and history and literature and philosophy all rolled into one.
That's a fabulous quote from Anne Smock, and I also think of the Montaigne's line, "Quand je danse, je danse. Quand je dors, je dors." So I imagine that was it was fabulous to come across that when you first read him. So which of the chapters of the essay is the one that over the years you find yourself returning to? And maybe it's the same question, maybe it's a different one, I don't know. Which is your favorite chapter of the essay?
Well, you said that I mentioned my favorite chapter, and I thought, oh no, I hope it's the same one I'm going to mention tonight. I will agree with, or today for you guys, some of you. So I agree with Valérie Dion. It's really hard to separate them out because they're so interconnected in many ways. But I'd have to say de l'expérience. And the reasons for that are multiple, but I think that it serves as a kind of viaticum after the fact, if you can have such a thing, or a guide to the three books. There's so much going on in that chapter that reflects on all the rest of the essays, not only on all the rest of the essays, but on the 16th century in general. So the essay begins and ends with learning or wisdom. The opening sentence is about Aristotle's claim that all men desire knowledge, and then it ends with Montaigne's reference to gay and social wisdom. And even the title itself seems to me to be doing what Montaigne is doing in his essays. De l'expérience, faire des essais, faire des expériences, balancer, pratiquer, éprouver. So these are all the things that it seems to me that he works through in the essays. So stylistically and linguistically, it's pure Montaigne. It connects, it quotes, it reconsiders, it meanders, it returns, it questions. But thematically, I'll just end with that. It foregrounds many broader, I think, preoccupations of the 16th century, like, and I'll just tick off a few, the humanist concern with the oracle of Delphi. But in Montaigne, the study of the self sheds light on the study of others, seems to me. I'll come back to that later. The second little point of thematic interest in that chapter is the idea of measure. And that measure, though, is not the 17th century sort of measure, but it's the measure that works against the chaos of the century, of the wars of religion, and in some ways works against the exuberance of Montaigne's own thought. And just a quick quote here, les plus belles vies sont à mon sens celles qui se conforment au modèle commun et humain, bien ordonné, mais sans rien d'extraordinaire, sans extravagance. So a few other instances of measure happen in the 16th century, and they work, it seems to me, also against the upheavals of the time, like the architectural symmetry, not as a constraint, but as a kind of search for proportionality. The success of the sonnet is an obvious example. Ned Duval has a wonderful new book on the forms of the 16th century and how they're inseparable from music. I always think of what Baudelaire said, is that a sonnet is Pythagorean. It's so precise. And so they were working with that form. And then, of course, those of you who know the century will remember the vers mesurés of Baïf and the Académie de la Musique. So the third little point of why I think this essay reflects the essays in general is the marvels of the physical. And Philip has already talked about my interest in that, but it comes after, but also responds to the anatomist, the blason du corps féminin, that the idea that felt experience isn't just sensory, but it's fundamental to human understanding. Je m'étudie plus qu'autre chose. C'est ma métaphysique. C'est ma physique. So he says, I study myself more than anything else. It's my metaphysics, my physics. So the physical encompasses both pain and pleasure. And by the way, just a little factoid that I discovered the other day, thanks to the Chicago site, there are twice as many references to pleasure as to pain in the essays, even though he talks about both. We well know his kidney stones and so on. There's also the notion of a kind of Epicurean ataraxia, that is la voie du milieu, and the idea that a wise palate should go with a wise heart. Another thing that I'm sort of passionate about and that you find in abundance in this essay is temporality, using time, marking time. I love this particular quote. Aesop, ce grand homme, vit son maître qui pissait en se promenant. Quoi donc fit-il? Nous faudra-t-il chier en courant? Ménageons le temps. Encore nous restant-il beaucoup d'oisifs et mal employés. So we think of Gargantua's education and the various institutions of children and kings, from Vivius to Erasmus to Ronsard. And then also along the line of temporality, the importance of the present. Quoi? Avez-vous pas vécu? What? Have you not lived? He responds. And this, for me, contradicts the exegi monumentum of the Pleiad. That is, the Pleiad, many of you are familiar with that, but Horace said, exegi monumentum, I raise my monument. So I'm writing this work not just for me and for my compatriots, but for the future. Whereas it seems to me that Montaigne, even though I don't think we need to take him at his word that it's only for his few friends and his family, he's also writing himself very much in the present. And another point of this essay that is so central is aging, and that the idea that aging calls into question the unitary image of the self, that we must learn that we are nothing but un sot, an idiot, as well as the implacable universality of aging. If we live long enough, it will happen to all of us. And here I would mention Cynthia Skenazy's really nice book on aging gracefully in the Renaissance. We're almost to the end of that. The fifth idea, once I got started on this, I couldn't stop. In an age rich with analogy, Montaigne insists not so much on likeness, which again is different from the thinking of his time, it seems to me, but on dissimilarity. And we'll come back to that in a minute. And finally, de l'expérience is clever. Au plus élevé trône du monde, si ne sommes assis que sur notre cul. On the highest throne in the world, we're only sitting on our own behinds.
Thank you, Cathy. It's really amazing how much there is in that one chapter, and that it's the final chapter. I mean, it's you know, a lot's been written about the order and the ordering of the chapters, but it's really quite amazing, as you just showed us, that that's where we end. And so if you haven't already answered that question, my next question, why do you think we should read Montaigne in 2023? Do you have one reason, several reasons?
Well, two quick-ish answers. One is general, and that's that history isn't just history, although it is that, but it's also what Max Weber called Wertbeziehung, or value relation. And that is, I think that we're doing what the humanists of the Renaissance were doing in some ways. That is, we go back to the Renaissance text to see how, among other things, how they might be speaking to us today. And I think that that's exactly what the humanists were doing, not only excavating ancient texts, but also seeing how they might make some sense in the 16th century world. And my specific answer is because Montaigne focuses on the self, but the personal has social and political consequences. So it's not the self in a vacuum. Yes, he has his arrière-boutique, right, that he goes to, but it's a self that's both fully aware and outwardly generous, and at the same time constantly questioning. So I think that what Montaigne does that is so contemporary is he helps us think about certain number of really important questions, like how to think outside of rigid frameworks and what to do with infinite information. This is very much to the point. How to interpret. Everyone says, and I do think it's true, and I even put that in the little part of the book that you read, that Montaigne works by modeling than by exhortation. And yet, again, I've found that in the essays there are 250 references to il faut. So there are a few recommendations in there. Another question, which couldn't be more pertinent this week, is how to approach warring factions. Montaigne's conciliatory stance, not caving to pressure, but trying to see the issues from different perspectives seems really important. And Valérie Dionne's book on this is really marvelous. And finally, I agree with Frank Lestringant, Montaigne rend heureux.
There's no better way to end our questionnaire today. So it's time.
Aren't you going to ask me about my book on Montaigne that I recommend?
I am indeed about to ask you that. Good point. It's COVID brain. So my fourth and final question in the questionnaire: which article or book about Montaigne, which you did not write, do you most often recommend to students, colleagues, or friends?
Là, tu nous poses une colle, hein? That's a very difficult question. And it'll be sort of multi-leveled again. So I did what every self-respecting academic would do in such a situation about which book to recommend of Montaigne. And that is that I went straight to ChatGPT. And what it said to me was that, well, Montaigne's essays came in number 3. After Sarah Bakewell's book and Dezon's Montaigne, A Life. But the really interesting one was number 4, and that was attributed by ChatGPT to Deirdre McCloskey. And when I looked her up, she wrote a book called How the World Got Rich. She's an economist. So you see where this is going. But at least when I asked the same question in French, I received a useful caveat. N'oubliez pas que les préférences en matière de lecture sont subjectives. But how I would answer your question, what do I most recommend? Well, I would ask the question, which Montaigne are you the most interested in? And then I would say, if you're interested in the philosophical Montaigne, I would recommend Hassan Melehy, Marie-Luce Demonet, and Ann Hartle. If you'd like to read about them. Excuse me, I'm also getting over something. Materialist Montaigne, Amy Graves Monroe, who, as you mentioned, just edited a volume and is doing much other work on Materialist Montaigne. She has a great article in that collection. I'd recommend Jessie Hock. She doesn't talk about Montaigne in her erotics of materialism, but she has an article in Modern Philology in 2022 in which she talks about Montaigne and Lucretius. It's really fabulous. For philological Montaigne, I'd go with Nathalie Dauvois and Jean Balsamo. For political ethical Montaigne, Valérie Dionne and Philippe Dezon. For transformative Montaigne, Emerson and Stefan Zweig. For mobile Montaigne, of course, Dauvois, Michel Jeanneret and François Rigolot. For contemporary takes on Montaigne, our very own Phillip Usher and Ali Ben Maklouf. And for approachable intros, Terence Gave and Antoine Compagnon. But to students and scholars, I recommend Michel de Certeau's Le Lieu de l'Autre, Montaigne des Cannibales, which was anthologized in English in Heterologies as The Savage Eye, and it's now available in French from Seuil, by the way, as an electronic publication. It's both philosophical and anthropological. He calls it a topological reading. And what's interesting about it is that he places the cannibal at the center of several discourses, whether they be Pyrrhonic or Aristotelian or Platonic. And he also says that other discourses coming in from these various directions are the contemporary commentators, the interpreters who gloss, amplify, and sometimes mislead, like the incompetent truchement or translator. He talks about the perceived ideas of the savage as being other voices that come in to act upon the cannibal, and Montaigne himself. And so the question is, how do you write a cannibal? And de Certeau has Montaigne appearing at the end of that essay, like some of the figures in Hieronymus Bosch's paintings that kind of look out at you when he writes, Mais quoi, il ne porte point de haut de choses. And finally, to the general public, what do I recommend? I actually do recommend Sarah Bakewell's Montaigne, How to Live, for people who've never read Montaigne, but also a much less known video by the Swiss-British journalist Alain de Botton, Montaigne on Self-Esteem. It is hysterical. And then finally, Timothy Hampton's chapter on Montaigne from his 2022 book on cheerfulness. He places Montaigne in a comparative context along with Rabelais and Jane Austen and Nietzsche, but he also talks about the end of de l'expérience and the gay and social wisdom. And what Hampton tries to show in this chapter is that in Montaigne's case, cheerfulness is tantamount to freedom. So cheerfulness allows him to have a power that enables the rejection of convention. Yes, it's self-delusion, but it's also grounded in social interaction. So those are my recommendations.
Thank you, Cathy. That's a veritable bibliography for us. Fantastic. I'll on the website I'll put the full titles and stuff so people can follow up on your suggestions, which are all fantastic. Michel de Certeau takes me back. Tom Connolly always had us read that in his Montaigne seminars. So it's a long time been a favorite of mine too. So we'll move into the second part of our conversation today, and it's time for Cathy to share some of her own thinking about Montaigne. And beyond what she's already been telling us. The topic is one that I think is going to get us talking. It's a topic that comes up from time to time in both erudite and less erudite ways, which often divides. And I think Cathy's going to do, or I know, having read her, is going to do a great job at introducing us to these questions and to not dividing us, hopefully. In any case, I hand the microphone over to you, and I look forward to hearing you. And again, to everybody listening, please don't hesitate to put your questions in the Q&A in English or French as of now, and I will read them out when we get to that part. Okay, over to you, Cathy. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. And I really want to start with a disclaimer, and that is that this is not exactly a scholarly paper in the traditional sense. I have only a few articles on Montaigne. I don't even claim to be a suffisante lectrice. But this talk will be an exploration by a reader of Montaigne, who I think in some ways belongs to all of us. And although I usually try to avoid writing epigrammatically, I'm going to borrow little bits for this conversation. And I really hope it will be that, and that you'll have things to say yourselves. And for that, I'm sorry that we won't be able to see each other in a way and discuss, because that's what this is meant to do. So here is my deceptively simple question in the form of a hypophora. Do Montaigne's essays reflect conservative thought? To explore this question, it seems reasonable to begin by two fundamental moves. First, briefly identifying in what sense we'll consider the word conservative, and second, making a few distinctions about historical context. In many ways, the question is anachronistic, of course, since the concept of conservatism did not exist as such in the 16th century. In today's parlance, the Oxford Dictionary helpfully furnishes associated words: anti-popular, buttoned down, corpocracy, diehard, ecclesiastico, fogey, mossy, old guard, retrograde, sex negative, and independent. But how is the term conservateur construed in Montaigne's time? The essayist uses the word only once and as a noun. Au siècle plus sage, revoqua-t-on le superbe titre de Capitolinus, qu'on avait auparavant donné à Marcus Manlius comme conservateur de la religion et liberté publique, a conservator of religion and public liberty, which indeed complements the 16th century definition of the term. Cotgrave's 1611 dictionary defines conservateur as a conservator, preserver, maintainer, defender, protector. So let's look at conservatism in that context: preserving, maintaining, defending. The second filter to keep in mind is that every reader of Montaigne lives in a certain historical moment, in a certain geographical space, as these few examples from the early 17th century remind us. For Pierre de Lancre in 1622, la vérité est que le sieur de Montaigne se donnait liberté de dire et coucher par écrit, non des opinions réglées de quelque sujet que ce fût, simplement ses conceptions convaincues d'absurdité, d'impertinence et de fausseté, laissant toute chose en doute, quoiqu'il semble hardiment et absolument les décider. And for those of you who might not speak French terribly well, just consider that these are real insults, saying that he doesn't know what he's talking about. Similarly, Pierre Camus, who had been an admirer of Montaigne in his youth, later repented in 1630 from the contagieuse lecture of the Essays, where he had picked up termes farouche, barbare, étrange. Gabriel Naudet in 1634 complains that Montaigne debases humanity in his apology to Raymond Sebon by assigning so many virtues to animals. And these varied opinions of Montaigne's immediate successors are only the tip of the iceberg. As you know, Montaigne's readers have fashioned him in infinitely different forms. Healthy, said Flaubert; joyously skeptical, said Nietzsche; and a kindred soul, said Emerson. For T.S. Eliot, Montaigne was a philosopher for poets. For Virginia Woolf, he represented the circumference of the soul in its confusion, its variety, its imperfection. So which Montaigne are we talking about? Montaigne, the conservator. Like many of us, Montaigne embodies contradiction in his convictions. He's at once religious and libertine, respectful and caustic. He writes of the tyranny of the laws, but spent 14 years as a magistrate and 4 years as mayor, and the list goes on. To define his position is in some ways to create one. In the Dictionnaire de Michel de Montaigne, Frédéric Brahamy states that Montaigne is unequivocally conservative because the essayist seeks to maintain the social system, not because it's better, but because change might involve violence. In other words, Montaigne takes a pragmatic stance. But what follows will complicate that conclusion. But it is true that several conservative principles obtain in Montaigne's work, beginning with number 1, an aversion to social unrest for any reason. Having seen the destruction and carnage of the popular revolt against the gabelle, the salt tax, in Bordeaux, as well as the chambre ardente that sent Protestants to their death, with retaliations involving pillaging of churches, statues, and even tombs, Montaigne understood all too well the personal and societal tolls of political upheaval. Although not as actively engaged in peacemaking as was Michel de l'Hôpital, Montaigne is known for his conciliatory stances, as we were saying, which brings us to the idea of conciliation as conservatism, stemming from a fear of destabilizing the social order. At the beginning of Book 3, Montaigne explains his success in negotiation. En ce peu que j'ai eu à négocier entre nos princes, en ces divisions et subdivisions qui nous déchirent aujourd'hui, j'ai curieusement évité qu'ils se méprincent en moi. Peu ont passé de main à autre avec moins de soupçons, plus de faveur et de privauté. So he says that he was a good negotiator among the princes. This passage underscores the importance of not upsetting any of the parties in a negotiation, of remaining true to oneself while avoiding conflict. The words éviter, soupçon, and faveur all point in that direction. But how to remain detached about something as divisive as religion during the wars? In the excellent collective volume published in 2021, Montaigne, Pensées en temps de guerre de religion, both Frank Lestringant and Jean Balsamo include articles on Montaigne's anti-Protestantism, replete with citations illustrating that position. Clearly, Montaigne rejects what might be called the immaterialization of religion by the Calvinists, which deprives faith of its physical and corporeal dimensions, just as he regrets their destabilizing of the social order. But Montaigne was also accused of being anti-Catholic. In 1589, when Henry IV acceded to the throne, the ultra-Catholic Ligueur continued to challenge his right to reign. At that crucial moment, Montaigne wrote to Henri to volunteer his services. When the king responded enthusiastically in January of 1590, Montaigne revealed that he had always wished for the succession, even though he had to confess it to his curate. Montaigne had also served as the official negotiator of Henri de Navarre, representing him in Paris during talks with King Henry III in 1588. Because of these relations, as well as Montaigne's compliments of other alleged heretics, extreme Catholics accused Montaigne of betraying his own religion, accusations that Marie de Gournay ties herself into knots to refute in her 1595 introduction to the Essays. Despite the religious conflicts, however, Montaigne remained loyal to both Henry III and Henry IV, which brings us to another burning query. Number 2, Montaigne's allegiance to the monarchy. While the king had been deemed to embody sacred qualities since the reign of Philippe le Bel, a specific politico-religious analogy took root in France during the reign of Charles V. Jean Gerson, in his 1405 Viva Rex, refers to the corpus mysticum in describing the structure of the kingdom. In this model, the king holds dominion over the body politic, just as Christ rules over the body of the church. From that parallel emerges the notion of a dual conception of kingship as theorized and described in Ernst Kantorowitz's The King's Two Bodies, the king's physical body on the one hand, and a symbolic, mystical body containing the dignitas, passed from generation to generation on the other. The depersonalized formula, Le roi est mort, vive le roi, made its first appearance at the funeral of Louis XII in 1515, which I didn't know until I started researching this, whereas before that, the king's names had been explicitly evoked. This depersonalizing underscores the automatic passage of the dignitas from one king to the next. While the physical body of the king dies, the persona ficta of the dignitas lives on. And you might think of this as a metaphor with the sort of parallel metonymy being the throne and the crown. So the crown is passed on, but the throne remains. So when Elizabeth II died last year and people cried, "The Queen is dead, long live the King," that had very little relation to the original meaning of the pronouncement. Unlike the Aristotelian vision of politics as a natural organization for the good of the community, and unlike the Christological tradition of the king's two bodies, Montaigne recognizes the human construction of civil authority. So in this sense, Montaigne also departs from his contemporaries in eschewing the association of the king with divinely ordained power transmitted from generation to generation. In 123, he enumerates, apparently without judgment, social structures of other lands, including those in which affairs of the government are left aux mains de la commune. In 140, he cites the king Iphicrates, who, when accused of not being an archer, guard, soldier, retorts, "Je ne suis rien de tout ça, mais je suis celui qui sait commander à tout cela." So I don't know how to do any of those things, but I know how to command people who do them. By professional formation or deformation, because Montaigne was a lawyer, he inevitably imagines the sovereign's power in a juridical light, and he serves celui qui sait commander as both subject and ambassador. He subscribes only in part to Etienne Dolet's position in De Officio Legati of 1541, namely that while an ambassador has a strict duty to his prince, he further has a broader duty to promote peace and harmony rather than war and discord. Montaigne describes the king's first duty as la justice et la science de conduire son peuple en paix et en guerre. And indeed, Montaigne remains loyal to his kings in both peace and war. Montaigne hesitated about whether to accept the unanimous recommendation of Bordeaux's municipal magistrates that he become mayor in 1581, but the deal was sealed when he received a letter from Henry III on 25 November of that year, including the following exhortation: "Monsieur de Montaigne, pour ce que j'ai en estime grande votre fidélité et zélée dévotion à mon service, vous ferez chose qui me sera très agréable et le contraire me déplairait grandement. When the king calls, Montaigne answers." A further indication of the essayist's unwavering allegiance to the monarch remains his silence during the Saint-Barthélemy massacre. As Alain Legros observes, in Montaigne's calendar, his éphéméride seigneuriale, the page remains blank for that day. Everything we know about Montaigne suggests that he would publicly deplore the unnecessary carnage and destruction. Many scholars have grappled with this question: Gérald Nacam, Jean-Louis Bourgeon, François Rigolot, Sergio Cardozo, and Arlette Joanna, to name only a few. The fact that Montaigne was initiated into the Order of Saint-Michel in 1571, a distinction conferred by the king, an order normally reserved for nobles of much higher rank than Montaigne's, might explain in part his fealty. Denis Crozet has hypothesized more broadly that the lacuna was meant to preserve the authority of the sovereign faced with the crisis and the polemics that followed. The massacre received the blessing of Pope Gregory XIII, who invited Parisians to celebrate the victory of the king against the heretics. Again, the king keeps coming back. The king was continually evoked in pamphlets to justify the Saint-Barthélemy Day massacre, as well as other violence against Protestants in the name of the country, as this title of an anonymous pamphlet illustrates. De la religion catholique et foi chrétienne des rois de France, œuvre par laquelle est montrée la dévotion et l'affection desquels rois envers les choses saintes et la punition par eux faite des hérétiques et des rebelles. So in this passage you have kings literally themselves prosecuting the heretics and the rebels. Montaigne later rejects the content of the pamphlets that accuse Charles IX of being crueler and more tyrannical than Nero, instead describing his king as notre pauvre feu Charles, Roi Charles IX. As Valérie Dion proposes, Montaigne envisions the king as both human and vulnerable, in contradistinction to Machiavelli, who urges kings to instill fear in their subjects. Montaigne's allegiance is not to a powerful or divinely appointed ruler, but to a human leader within a humanly constructed political system. Stefan Zweig imagines Montaigne to be posing the following question: how can I extract myself from the tyrannical exigencies that the state, the church, or the political system want to impose on me at all costs? But Montaigne never refers to his own king as tyrannical, nor of his desire to escape the state. Granted, as we see in Descoches, imperial powers, notably the Spaniards, can be cruel and ruthless, and granted, like La Boétie, he scrupulously avoids the direct parallels between absolutist historical rulers and his own king. But Montaigne's freedom is a freedom within the limits of the law and, to a certain degree, the limits of custom. In this sense, freedom involves the possibility of emancipation while simultaneously adhering to established parameters. This position can easily be qualified as conserving the status quo, a final example of which is, number 3, Montaigne's hesitancy to publish La Boétie de la servitude volontaire. Explaining in a letter to his father his reasons for choosing not to publish La Servitude Volontaire and another political text of La Boétie, Montaigne writes laconically, Je leur trouve la façon trop délicate et mignarde pour les abandonner au grossier et pesant air d'une si mal plaisante saison. When Simon Goulart published La Servitude Volontaire in 1577, Montaigne notes that the text was mixed with Protestant polemical works and thus was no longer presentable in a neutral context. Indeed, on May 7th of 1579, the Parlement of Bordeaux ordered Goulart's volume, including La Servitude, to be burned, and 2 days later, the publisher Simon Milange received the privilege to print the essays. Not only would this banning have made it hazardous for Milange to publish the treatise in Montaigne's work, but Milange had also been named the imprimeur du roi in 1576, printing the very acts of Parliament that condemned the anonymous text. At the same time, and I wonder if this is the equivalent of Macron's en même temps, despite the excising of the servitude volontaire from the essays, Montaigne leaves proof in De l'Amitié of his real but thwarted intention to publish it by featuring it so visibly as the source of his and La Boétie's friendship, as Michel Magnan has pointed out. The fact remains nonetheless that Montaigne ultimately chose not to publish the potentially dangerous treatise. The idea that sovereignty belongs not to the king or to God, but to the people, who could simply refuse to obey, remained virtually inconceivable, even during an era of less than exemplary royalty. The contemporaneous political and ideological conflicts also explain the rapid appropriation of La Servitude Volontaire by Calvinists, notably by the monarchomaques, or those who seek to destroy kingdoms and monarchies. The message? France must end the tyranny of the papacy and of the Machiavellian Italians. Isn't that interesting how both the Protestants and the Catholics accused one another of not being French enough? In this fraught context, Montaigne chose once again not to enter the fray. All these examples clearly contribute to the impression of Montaigne as a true conservator. his efforts to avoid conflict at all costs, his fast allegiance to the king, and what some might call his pusillanimity in shying away from the publication of the Servitude volontaire. Yet most of Montaigne's essays expose several ways of thinking, often calling into question received ideas and social values, which suggests a counter-characterization of the essayist. Montaigne the Challenger. Since the 1970s, much has been written about the self in Montaigne, defining the self, being with oneself, writing about oneself, the self as other, but broader societal implications inevitably ensue. I'll touch briefly on 3 essays, all of which foreground Montaigne as challenger, and all of which pose vital questions that extend beyond the personal and beyond the 16th century. First, De Botton has everything to interest contemporary readers, from the interrogation of language and reflexive writing to disability studies, skepticism toward institutions, and of course, the question of credulity, in this case, faced with miracles and witches. But more broadly of interest for our purposes is Montaigne's reconceptualization of difference. Adopting an Augustinian view, Montaigne writes that what we call deformity is not so in the eyes of God, who created humans of all sorts, with a vision of a whole that we as mere mortals cannot understand. But he takes the argument much further. Montaigne's insistence on his own deformities serves to suggest that all of us are in some way deformed. While Montaigne recognizes the power of beauty, notably in De la Physionomie, here we're far from the Neoplatonic formulation of kalogathia, a Greek word meaning both good and beautiful, and closer to the conviction that exterior beauty is entirely separable from interior beauty and depth, as exemplified in Socrates, Rabelais, Silène, and La Boétie himself. Moreover, in a perfect example of the perils of post hoc ergo propter hoc arguments, Montaigne exposes and then debunks the rumor that cripples make the best lovers, either because they don't get enough exercise and have conserved their energy, or because their genitals are more developed due to the inactivity of other body parts. De Botton serves as a pendant to d'un enfant monstrueux, in which Montaigne notes that we consider unnatural whatever is different, whatever we do not understand. The fear of otherness, in other words, hinders an acceptance of diversité, which, as you probably know, is a central word in Montaigne's lexicon. He uses forms of divers and diversité 268 times in the essays. The essayist implicitly rejects the possible causes for deformity, cited amply by Ambroise Paré and others, whereby a handicap is a punishment by God, a result of the mother's bad dreams, the father's insufficient sperm, or any of other several root causes. Among many ideas in this essay, Montaigne upends the fear of difference. Another rejection or reconsideration of the doxa of the day appears in Coutume de l'Île de Céa. Here, as in De Cannibal, Montaigne takes an anthropological turn, but this time concerning the question of suicide. In the 16th century, as you know, suicide was universally condemned by both scientific and religious communities. The Council of Trent in 1545 rejected suicide, insisting that humans cannot usurp God's power by taking their own lives at will. As a logical extension of the 5th commandment, the council states, La loi ne dit pas vous ne tuerez point les autres, mais simplement vous ne tuerez point. So the commandment doesn't say you won't kill others, it simply says, thou shalt not kill. The Council of Reims in 1583 went so far as to threaten excommunication for those who would attempt to bury suicides. Even more troubling, in Calvinist Geneva, authorities ordered that bodies of suicide victims be dragged on a hurdle, impaled, and left outside as a deterrent to others. Set against these patent strictures, Montaigne's complex and nuanced position on the subject of suicide on the island of Kea appears all the more surprising. For André Tournon, Montaigne's lack of determinacy about the justification of suicide in this essay can be compared to Escher's engravings of geometrical figures, always shifting. It's true that Montaigne offers a number of conflicting opinions, notably classical, scrupulously avoiding contemporaneous theological references. but it seems to me that a dominant position emerges in two instances. Suicide is arguably justifiable in cases of enduring pain and the fear of a worse death. Montaigne adds so many examples of apparently justifiable suicides that the essay more than doubles between 1580 and 1595. The C version crystallizes a simple syllogism. If I do not break the laws against theft when I take my own possessions, then I should not be held responsible for murder if I take my own life. Who, in other words, should have jurisdiction over the body, if not the self? But as we have come to expect from Montaigne, ceci ne va pas sans contraste. Concerned with both corporeal and moral autonomy, Montaigne broaches directly the question of individual freedom within the confines of 16th century thought. Dieu nous donne assez de congés quand il nous met en tel état que le vivre nous est pire que le mourir. La plus volontaire mort, c'est la plus belle. La vie dépend de la volonté d'autrui, la mort de la nôtre. So life depends on someone else's will, death depends on ours. By exposing multiple instances of justifiable suicide and yet another example of a nuanced moral, Montaigne comes daringly close to rejecting centuries of Christian writings on the subject. A final example of Montaigne's refusal to sanction the established practices of his day is the reformulation of the notion of repentance in Du Repentir 3.2. As early as the 12th century, repentir, from the Latin paenitere, to regret, had meant manifester le regret d'avoir commis une faute. But for Montaigne, regret is decidedly not the point. Here we see, ever so subtly, Montaigne's rejection of religious piety in favor of a more profound human morality. Repentance, as conceived by Montaigne in this chapter, has much in common with the Jewish concept of teshuva. Often translated from Hebrew as repentance, it literally means a return to one's natural state or to God. If the offense is committed against another, forgiveness must be asked, and the wrong must be righted, restituted, or repaired in some way. Repentance, in other words, is useless without subsequent action. As in teshuva, Montaigne writes that confession doesn't suffice. In fact, repentance can be self-destructive because it assumes a disavowal of our will in the attempt to erase a past action. Pascal goes so far as to accuse Montaigne of not believing in repentance at all. But for Montaigne, rather, il faut que Dieu nous touche le courage. As you know, courage has several meanings in the 16th century, the most pertinent here being volonté, or will. True repentance is not a ceremonious practice, but rather a change of heart, a modulation of the will. Il faut que notre conscience s'amende d'elle-même par renforcement de notre raison. As Véronique Ferrer points out in another context, Montaigne replaces the sentiment vivre with the sentiment vivre. So not living holily or saintly, but living healthily. With his semi-conclusion in Du Repentir are interwoven the essayist's thoughts on aging and the deteriorating body according to what is natural and fitting, as he writes. The metaphysical is inextricable from the physical. Temporality, to come back to this question, is also key in this essay. In a Heraclitean twist, the present cannot censure the past. For this reason, older people, he says, who regret the errors of their youth and criticize the lack of chastity or moderation in the young, fail to see that their impetus and their bad digestion are responsible for their current state, not their virtue. Once again, Montaigne tosses in a playful jab as he wraps up his challenge to one of the foundations of Catholic practice. The ending of the essay sends us back to the beginning. The mutation of the human body echoes the movement of human life. Le monde n'est qu'un branloir pérenne. The least conservative constituents of Montaigne's work are thus reflected less in his political positions than in his provocative thought. In implicitly or explicitly rejecting such fundamental principles as the nature of difference, accepted opinion concerning suicide, and repentance as conceived by Catholic theology, he challenges epistemologically established doxa and practices. To conclude, shall we say that Montaigne's essays reveal a conservative stance? Yes, absolutely, and no, not always. The essays embodied what Joshua Landy terms axiological complexity, meaning that values are explicitly placed in conflict in the text. but Montaigne makes walking a tightrope among the different factions look easy. Despite his guarantees that the book was destined à la commodité particulière de mes parents et amis, readers know better, and Simon Milange, who published the first edition of the Essays in Bordeaux, knew better. Montaigne's writings were an instant success. Ultimately, the essayist may have well been writing for all readers, for the very ones who take on la forme entière de l'humaine condition. But let's not stop there. There's a method to the madness of not only writing, but also being in outramque partem. Montaigne keeps moving. Tout ne branle-t-il pas votre branle? One of my favorite quotes from De l'Expérience is precisely something Montaigne seems to aspire to, but never achieves, a kind of oneness. Quoting Marshall near the end of his 3-volume opus, Montaigne writes, quis ubique habitat, Maxime, nusquam habitat. To be everywhere, Maximus, is to be nowhere. Not necessarily so, I would argue. Montaigne comes the closest to being everywhere of any writer I know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cathy. It was great to hear the conclusion, which I hadn't heard before. And as you say in the conclusion, I mean, this question, right, which is often phrased as, is Montaigne conservative? You show so clearly that there's no yes/no answer, right, or there's a yes and no answer. So he's on the one hand, politically conservative during the wars of religion, right, with Henri III and Henri de Navarre, but then on the other hand, has perhaps greater freedom or progressivism or radical thinking in other matters, as you show with human difference, religious judgments on suicide and other matters for that fact. So yeah, a huge thank you. So those of you who are excuse me, listening, don't hesitate to put questions in the chat in English or French, and I will read them out. And I'm going to abuse my position of controlling the Zoom to ask a first question, which is still which has to do with the importance of thinking about these questions today, right? About his conservatism or potential conservatism. So every day, when I walk home from dropping off my daughter at school, there's a truck that I pass that's always parked in the same place, and it has a bumper sticker which reads, "Carry like it's 1776." And as most American listeners will know, it's a reference to the Second Amendment, right, to the right to bear arms. And to gloss for anyone who doesn't walk past such stickers every day, it means something like, as far as I understand it, I assert my individual right to have a gun in my house because I choose to believe that an 18th century legal decision can unproblematically be maintained today, right, in the 21st century. And so, for those of us who live in North America, that's like one of many reasons why we need to ask what it means to be conservative, and why I think Montaigne can help us ask questions about conserving old laws, about how laws change or how they don't change, and when we should change them, and why we should change them, and when we shouldn't change them, and all this kind of stuff. So all of that to say, why did you want to talk about conservatism today? Because I think it is such an important question.
Well, partially because some of the readers of Montaigne say he's not that pertinent today because he's so conservative. And particularly students will occasionally jump on one particular thing and say, well, that's conservative. And unfortunately, to some extent in today's world, when students put a label on something, then you have to sort of hammer through that. And so I wanted to start by saying, is the only thing we think about how someone thinks about sovereignty, for example, or how someone thinks about being faithful to the political order or something like that. And in which ways can a really smart thinker like Montaigne undo all that? And so that one of my entries into the subject was that it's such a conversation among people who begin to read Montaigne. I think in our field, I mean, as we've seen here tonight, and all of you know from discussions, we've already thought about the pros and the cons, and we already knew before I got to my conclusion that the answer is yes and no. And yet, how does that work? So that was, yeah, it had a lot to do with contemporary thought in general, and sort of shaking up ways that many of us, I mean, some of us are also guilty of that, of getting an idea and not doing enough dialogue about the idea.
Mm-hmm. So I have another question that I actually wanted. Well, okay, I'm going to ask it anyway, even though we want to get to questions from other people. But what you said there about talking with students and I think a lot of what was really important about what you said today is presenting Montaigne as the he a model for stepping outside of a sort of one issue voting and getting outside of your own box and stuff like that. And I was rereading recently Christophe Bardin's biography of Montaigne, and he has this when he's talking about the Henri de Navarre and Henri III negotiations in Paris, right, in 1588, he quotes this Spanish ambassador who is so Bernardino de Mendoza, and who was in favor of the Duke of Guise and the Catholic League and stuff, but that's not really important here. But so he says this about Montaigne when he's writing about his presence at the negotiations. Il est tenu pour un homme intelligent, encore qu'un peu brouillon. And I just think that's beautiful. Encore qu'un peu brouillon. Like it's known that he's there as sort of to be aligned with Henri de Navarre, and yet at the same time, the other folks who are there don't quite know what his position is. And so, if I was going to turn this into a question, I guess it would be, when we say he's politically conservative, do we really mean that he's just very good at living with others, right? And he's good at diplomacy.
Well, absolutely. At the beginning of book 3, I mean, some critics have characterized it as his bragging about his ability in negotiation. But I think some of it comes from the sense that he's listening. And we know that he listens to classical texts, he listens to different opinions. He may not agree with them, but then he goes and adds them to his essays, right? In the continual adding, rather than correcting, which capsulates the thought, right? And so I think you're right. I think that that the conservatism that we attribute to Montaigne goes only so far, in that his way of thinking is not set in stone, and that is kind of a conservative position, right? To have something that's set in stone, and wanting to again to come back to the notion of preserving, maintaining, but he doesn't stop there. I do think it's hard in the 16th century to imagine, as I was saying, to imagine a kind of democracy. I mean, there's this one point in which he says democracy. He says he talks about la domination populaire, and how he would not want to have that at all, even though it is more natural and it would be more just. But he wouldn't want to have it because it would be pure chaos. He doesn't say that. He says what I said before, but the implication being it wouldn't work. But he's again in Essais, but several other essays where he talks about other cultures, about cultures in which women are leaders. He doesn't. It's sort of his especo, or however you pronounce his motto in Greek, that he suspends judgment.
Thank you, Cathy. So I'm going to go to questions in the Q&A, and I think you'll be able, if you click on Q&A, Cathy, you'll be able to read them too, as I read them out, which can be helpful. I'm going to scroll down to where should we start? Let's start with questions directly related to conservatism and stuff to start with. So from John O'Brien, who first of all has a suggestion of taking a suggestion about Le Gros, which I'll send to you by email to make sure you have it. But his question is, so how is Montaigne's stance as a conserver i.e. a preserver, modified or nuanced by his acute sense of flux, dispersal, and loss?
Great question, and they are both included in the essays for sure. I mentioned the word dialogue. I think, we think of the 16th century as being a century of dialogue from Taillerault and Le Caron and Thiard. But Montaigne doesn't even need an interlocutor. I mean, he makes his own dialogue throughout the text. And so I do think, yes, the sense of flux, that's one of the arguments in favor of his less than conservative thinking, if you can sort of separate that out from a political stance, because it was pretty clear that Montaigne was never going to question whether there should be a monarchy, or at least we don't have evidence, I think, that that was the case, even though he cites these other civilizations that seem to work quite well without a king. So I think there's always that tension there between his having a position, namely conservatism in certain ways, and his constantly being in flux.
So we have a question from Jean-Claude Caron. Il n'a pas été question de sa position vis-à-vis du Nouveau Monde. N'y aurait-il pas là aussi un non-conservatisme évident? So in English, we didn't talk today about the New World. Would there be something to be said there about his evident non-conservatism?
Oh, well, thank you, Jean-Claude, and thank you, John, too. Let's see. Once I said thank you, I let this question go away. Yes. His idea on the New World. Great question. I think that on that particular question, I'm gonna agree a little bit with Lestringant, and that is that Montaigne wasn't entirely against the idea of colonialism, because he lived in a century where they were exploring and so forth and so on. He was definitely, and you see this in Descoches, you see it somewhat in Des Cannibales aussi, but he definitely is against the Spanish treatment of the natives and the native cultures, and he most definitely sees that sort of transcultural exchange going on, so that when the cannibal comes and says, well, how in the world are all these men obeying this little tiny king who's only 10 years old or something like that? So definitely there's a richness in his notion of the other. And in that sense, I agree with Ben Macrouf that there's a whole lot of sort of openness to other cultures going on there. But I also think that what he's really criticizing about the colonial enterprise is not so much the voyages there and the taking over to some extent, as it is about the way that the Spaniards have treated people. But I'd love to hear what you think, Jean-Claude.
Actually, Jean-Claude just followed up. So he was thinking less about colonialism than about the open attitude about their way of life, he said.
Yes, right. Well, there I'll hand it to you that he found it very interesting. He doesn't go as far as Léry, of course, who talks about communion as eating raw meat of the French, but still, there's definitely an openness to looking at things from that cross-cultural perspective that we haven't seen much before.
So I have a question now from someone else you know well, Sofia Buere, who is writing a fantastic thesis at the moment about violence and the wars of religion, as I'm pretty sure you know. So thank you so much for an interesting talk, Cathy. You mentioned Montaigne's silence on the day of the Saint-Barthélemy, which makes his reaction to its depiction on the walls of the Vatican's Sala Regia striking. Pope Gregory XIII having updated his commissioning of Vasari upon learning of the massacre. In the Journal de Voyage, Montaigne remarks on the frescoes, but does not explicitly mention the massacre, noting only that Coligny's injury and death are authentically portrayed. And Sophia gives this quote, Il y a aussi deux endroits où la blessure de Monsieur l'Amiral de Châtillon est peinte et sa mort bien authentiquement. So she asks, would you see this as part of the tightrope that Montaigne is walking across? And do you think that the focus on Coligny's singular body is significant here as well?
Great question. I would love to hear your answer to it. Yeah, I do think it's part of the tightrope that Montaigne is walking. And as you say, it's there, but it isn't there. It's there in the background of the essays, but it's not in the foreground of the essays. And as you say, this Vatican walls, that's something new to me. So that is very striking. But the Pope and the King, I mean, those are the reasons that he doesn't speak out against it, right? But this is a very interesting thing. I would love to go further on that. But I think you've absolutely nailed it by saying that it's the tightrope that he's walking.
Thank you, Cathy. Thank you, Sophia. Let's see. So we have a question from Nadine Cuperti, who's also our next speaker next week, as I'll say shortly. So her question, pourrait-on revenir sur l'éthos de la guerre de Montaigne et le mettre en relation avec la nouvelle noblesse de Montaigne? So could we think about the Montaigne's ethos at war or of war and connected to his new nobility?
Great question too. His new nobility. Well, I do think that his willingness to come when called by the king, and again, his having been appointed to the Order of Saint-Michel raises him up, and his family, as you say, is nouvellement noble. And so I think that that's a very good question. But it certainly plays in to his relationship to the king and to his relationship to nobility in general. And therefore, since those are the people who are in power and who are some of them aligned with the Ligue, but all of them aligned with the king on the Catholic side, then that doesn't leave Montaigne much choice.
So I'm going to allow myself to ask another question before going back to a question from Jenny Oliver. But so my question, so as I listen to you, one of the things that sort of jumped out at me was, the some of the other words that connect to the idea of being conservative, and one word that sort of jumped to mind was the word ébranlé and ébranlement, which come up quite a lot in the essay. And so at various moments, he talks about, the soul, l'âme can be shaken, faith can be shaken, the body can be shaken, emotions can be shaken. When he says, for example, in 231, il n'est passion qui ébranle tant la sincérité des jugements que la colère. And then in 3:13, which you already talked to us about, there's a great line, je m'ébranle difficilement et suis tardif partout à me lever, à me coucher, à me repas. So ébranlé in the sense of he has a tough time shaking himself into the day, kind of thing, which I'm now going to quote that on Tough Mornings. All of which to say, throughout Montaigne, and this is somewhat echoing, I guess, John O'Brien's question, there's a wariness over being shaken, over being rattled, over being unnerved, and not just politically, but also in the self. And so, I think, I really liked how you put side by side the political question and the question of the self. And I guess the question I wanted to ask was really about his writing of the self. And in his, what Michel Bourgeot will call his autoportrait, he's not, or is he he seems to not be conservative in his choice of forms, right? He's not beholden to other forms about writing the self, even as he's trying to talk about the sort of coexistence of stillness with agitation.
Yeah.
So, question about the non-conservative nature of his form, the form of his writing.
Yeah. Not only is the form not conservative, but also he doesn't even use the forms that are available to him, like citations and titles, in a traditional way, right? So that sometimes you're reading and you read one of the quotations and you kind of have to puzzle out exactly what is the role of this, whereas oftentimes quotations illustrate very clearly what's happening in the text. So I think that's a really good point. The exploration that happens there, the branle, the ébranlé. I mean, I think that there's this, again, counterbalancing of the really Heraclitean movement that is necessary, that is natural, that is part of the human life cycle, set against the kind of upheavals, his house being broken into, the whole wars of religion. So I think that you have both of those kind of branle going on concomitantly, and maybe that's why he has his moments of saying that he has his arrière-boutique, he has his back room that he goes to in his mind to serve as a kind of counterbalance to that kind of movement. But I guess I would argue that there are some kind of movements that he absolutely subscribes to and wishes that everyone considered them more natural than they do. And then the kind that come from war and distress.
So changing topic, I'm going to go to a final question from Jenny Oliver. Dear Cathy, thank you for a wonderfully rich and inspiring discussion. I'm struck by your point that Montaigne gives more weight to pleasure than to pain. What are some of the most striking or surprising instances of things that give him pleasure for you? Let's end on pleasure.
Well, Virgil is better than sex, he says. Poetry can give more pleasure than the physical, and yet the physical is right there in all of his work. I mean, what Philip just cited earlier, Quand je danse, talks about, when I walk in a garden, I'm in the garden. So that the pleasure, I guess that part is not surprising. But I think, if I looked at all the ways in which plaisir occurred, I think that'd be very, very interesting, Jenny. I noticed that the word plaisir is used more in the Vers de Virgile than in any other essay, and that has to do with sex. So that probably tells us something, but it also has to do with poetry. So that tells us something else.
Thank you so much, Cathy. Thank you for joining us today. It's been a great pleasure to listen and to learn with you.
Thank you, Philip, and thanks to everyone. Thank you.
So there are two more episodes of conversations with people who read Montaigne this semester. The next one, which is hors série, unusually very soon, is next Monday on November 6th, and I'll be talking with Professor Nadine Couperti, who is professor at Tel Aviv University and who is currently a visiting scholar at NYU. This will be in French at 1 p.m. New York time, 7 p.m. Paris time, as clocks will have changed by then. Thank you, Cathy, for pointing that out to me. The episode after that in English will be on November 27th at 1 p.m., also 7 p.m. Paris time, and I'll be talking with Professor Jeff Purcells from the University of Southern Carolina. And it will be a slightly different episode for reasons that I won't get into here, but I promise you that it will be exciting. All episodes of the series are or will be available on the Maison Française's YouTube channel, and you can consult them as well as accompanying materials such as summaries of each episode and bibliographical references by going to montaigne.us. For more information about this series and other events at NYU's Maison Française, please sign up for the Maison Française's newsletter, which you can do by simply Googling NYU Maison Française newsletter. It remains for me to thank the Maison Française, especially François Nudelman and Courtney Rutherford, the Department of French Literature, Thought and Culture and its chair, Emily Apter, and NYU's Medieval and Renaissance Center and its director, Martha Rust. And especially thank you to you, Cathy Yandell, and thank you to all of you who joined us today. See you again soon.